At 2:34 a.m. on May 15, 1944, 17-year-old Hannie Schaft crouched in the darkness beside a bridge outside Harlem, her fingers wrapped around a stolen Walther P-38 pistol. The target was approaching on a bicycle, a Dutch collaborator who had betrayed 6 Jewish families to the Gestapo the previous week. She could hear the rhythmic squeak of his bicycle chain growing louder in the pre-dawn silence. Her partner, a resistance fighter named Jan Boonkamp, lay hidden 30 meters away, ready to block the target's escape route. Hannie's hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from cold and the weight of what she was about to do. She was a law student who had never fired a weapon until 3 months earlier. A bookish girl with distinctive red hair who had spent her teenage years studying Roman law and attending lectures on constitutional theory. Now she was an assassin, and the man pedaling toward her through the darkness had no idea that his life would end in the next 45 seconds. This single operation represented a turning point in the Dutch resistance movement, the moment when passive resistance transformed into active warfare, when middle-class students became urban guerrillas, and when a teenage girl with a pistol became the most wanted person in Nazi-occupied Netherlands. By the time liberation came 14 months later, Hannie Schaft would be personally responsible for eliminating dozens of high-value targets, leading hundreds of resistance operations, and inspiring an entire generation of Dutch fighters who called her the girl with the red hair, and whispered her exploits like legends. Johanna Schaft, known to everyone as Hannie, was born on September 16, 1920, in Haarlem, a historic Dutch city known for its tulip fields, art museums, and quiet bourgeois prosperity. Her parents were teachers, educated middle-class professionals who raised their daughter in an atmosphere of books, debates, and progressive politics. She excelled academically, particularly in languages and law, and enrolled at the University of Amsterdam in 1938 to study law with the intention of becoming an attorney specializing in international law. She was idealistic but not radical, patriotic but not militaristic, someone who believed problems should be solved through reasoned argument and legal process. When Germany invaded the Netherlands on May 10, 1940, she was 19 years old and in her second year of university, more concerned about upcoming exams than geopolitics. The Dutch government had maintained strict neutrality and assumed their neutrality would be respected as it had been during World War I. The assumption proved catastrophically wrong. German forces overwhelmed Dutch defenses in 5 days, bombing Rotterdam into submission and forcing a surrender that shocked the nation into traumatized disbelief. The occupation began with promises of correct behavior and respect for Dutch sovereignty, but these assurances dissolved rapidly as Nazi racial policies were implemented with bureaucratic efficiency. Jewish students were expelled from universities in 1941, including Hannie's close friends and study partners. She watched as people she had known for years were forced to register, wear yellow stars, and eventually disappear into transit camps. Her response was immediate and instinctive. She refused to continue her education at a university that collaborated with racial persecution, and she began helping Jewish families hide or escape. Her initial resistance work was cautious and conventional, the kind of activity that thousands of ordinary Dutch citizens engaged in during the early occupation years. She helped forge identity documents, transported contraband ration cards, and passed messages between resistance cells. She used her student status as cover, traveling between cities with false papers hidden in textbooks and lecture notes. Her red hair made her conspicuous, but she compensated by adopting an aggressively ordinary appearance, dressing in drab conservative clothing and affecting the demeanor of a provincial student too naive to be dangerous. German security forces looking for resistance fighters expected hardened criminals or obvious radicals, not middle-class girls who looked like they belonged in libraries. She exploited this assumption ruthlessly, walking past checkpoints with weapons hidden under her coat and contraband documents in her handbag, relying on the guards' gender prejudices to avoid serious searches. For nearly 2 years, she operated in this gray zone between legal and illegal activity, helping people escape Nazi persecution without directly engaging in violence. But by late 1943, the character of the occupation had changed fundamentally. The initial period of relatively restrained control had given way to brutal suppression, mass deportations, and increasingly sophisticated counter-resistance operations. Passive resistance was no longer enough because the price of passivity was systematic genocide. The Dutch resistance needed to move beyond document forgery and hiding people. It needed to actively disrupt Nazi operations, eliminate collaborators who made persecution possible, and demonstrate that occupation would be contested violently. Hannie made her decision during a resistance meeting in November 1943 when organizers asked for volunteers willing to conduct armed operations against targets the movement had identified as high-priority threats. The room fell silent because everyone understood what was being requested. Armed resistance meant execution if captured, not just imprisonment. It meant accepting that you might have to kill people at close range, looking them in the face while pulling the trigger. Most importantly, it meant crossing a psychological boundary that separated helpers from fighters, supporters from soldiers. Hannie raised her hand almost immediately, one of only 3 people in the room willing to volunteer. Her comrades tried to talk her out of it, arguing that her red hair made her too recognizable and that women faced special risks if captured by the Gestapo. She countered that her appearance was actually an advantage because German soldiers and Dutch police still didn't seriously consider women as potential threats. She also pointed out that she spoke fluent German and could pose as a collaborator sympathizer, if questioned. The resistance leadership reluctantly accepted her, pairing her with Jan Bonekamp, an experienced fighter who could provide tactical training. Over the following weeks, she learned to strip, clean, and fire various pistols and revolvers that the resistance had acquired through theft or black market purchases. She practiced shooting in abandoned warehouses, learning to control breathing and manage recoil, to aim instinctively rather than carefully, and most importantly, to pull the trigger without hesitation. Her instructors emphasized that armed resistance operations required speed and decisiveness. Hesitation meant capture or death, both for the operative and for everyone connected to them. Her first kill happened in January 1944, and it nearly ended her resistance career before it properly began. The target was a Dutch police officer who had personally arrested 43 Jews and delivered them to German authorities for deportation. The resistance had tried warning him repeatedly, leaving threatening notes and even confronting him directly, but he continued his work and began actively hunting resistance members. The decision was made to eliminate him both as punishment and as a deterrent to other collaborators. Hannie and Jan tracked him for 3 days, learning his routines and identifying vulnerable moments when he would be isolated. They chose a street corner near his home where he passed every evening at approximately 7:30 p.m., a stretch of poorly lit road with multiple escape routes. When he appeared on schedule, Hannie stepped out of the shadows and called his name. When he turned toward her, confused to see a young woman addressing him, she shot him twice in the chest from less than 3 meters away. The sound was shockingly loud in the quiet residential street, much louder than it had been during practice sessions in the warehouse. He staggered backward, blood spreading across his coat, and collapsed against a brick wall. She stood frozen, staring at what she had done until Jan grabbed her arm and pulled her into motion. They ran through pre-planned escape routes, ditching the pistol in a canal and separating to avoid being caught together. She made it back to her safe house and vomited repeatedly, shaking with adrenaline and horror at having killed someone. She didn't sleep that night, couldn't eat the next day, and seriously considered abandoning resistance work entirely. But then reports came back about the collaborators' activities, detailed accounts of families he had destroyed, and she realized that her horror was a luxury she couldn't afford. The people being deported to death camps didn't have the option to walk away from violence. Over the following months, she became one of the most effective armed operatives in the Dutch resistance, participating in dozens of operations that ranged from targeted assassinations to weapons theft to prisoner rescues. She worked primarily in the Haarlem and Amsterdam regions, targeting collaborators, German military personnel, and Dutch Nazis who made occupation possible. Her methods were coldly pragmatic and adapted to urban warfare conditions. She frequently posed as a romantic interest, approaching targets in bars or on streets and engaging them in conversation before shooting them at close range. Her youth and feminine appearance made this tactic remarkably effective because targets never suspected danger until the moment she drew her weapon. She also exploited the bicycle culture of the Netherlands, using bicycles for approach, escape, and as mobile platforms for drive-by shootings. In one operation, she and Jan intercepted a truck transporting confiscated ration cards, shooting the Dutch police guards and distributing the cards to resistance networks that fed hundreds of people hiding from deportation. In another, she helped break a resistance fighter out of a police station by walking in dressed as a civilian visitor and shooting 2 guards while accomplices freed the prisoner. She survived multiple close calls, including one incident where German soldiers stopped her at a checkpoint and found a pistol in her bag. She claimed she had found it and was taking it to police headquarters to turn it in, a lie so audacious that the soldiers believed her and let her proceed. The Gestapo became obsessed with identifying her specifically after intelligence reports indicated that a woman with red hair was involved in multiple high-profile assassinations. They knew her by description, but not by name. And they circulated wanted posters throughout occupied Netherlands offering substantial rewards for information leading to her capture. The posters described the girl with the red hair as extremely dangerous and warned citizens not to approach her directly. This notoriety made her simultaneously more vulnerable and more valuable to the resistance. She was vulnerable because her distinctive hair made her easier to identify in crowds, but valuable because her growing legend inspired other resistance fighters and terrified collaborators who realized they could be targeted at any moment. She attempted to dye her hair black to reduce recognition risk, but the dye job was unsuccessful and made her appearance even more distinctive. Eventually, she began wearing headscarves and hats constantly, trying to conceal the feature that had become her identifying characteristic. Despite these precautions, her operational effectiveness remained high throughout 1944, as Allied forces advanced across France and Belgium toward the Netherlands. The German occupation became increasingly brutal in its final phase, with mass reprisal executions and widespread food confiscation creating a famine that killed thousands of Dutch civilians during the winter of 1944 to 45, a period remembered as the Hunger Winter. The resistance's relationship with armed operations remained deeply controversial even among its own members. Many resistance organizers believed that assassinating collaborators and German personnel provoked savage reprisals against innocent civilians that outweighed any tactical benefit. The Nazi policy of executing 10 Dutch hostages for every German killed meant that each successful resistance attack could result in dozens of innocent deaths. This created an agonizing moral calculus. Was killing one collaborator worth the lives of 10 hostages? The resistance leadership debated this endlessly, with some arguing for restricting operations to intelligence gathering and sabotage that avoided direct casualties. Hannie and other armed operatives argued that passive resistance had failed to prevent genocide and that collaborators needed to fear concrete consequences for their participation in mass murder. They pointed out that Nazi reprisals would continue regardless of resistance activity because the occupation was fundamentally based on terror. The debate was never fully resolved, and individual resistance cells made their own decisions about which operations to conduct. Hannie's cell, working in the Haarlem region under the Council of Resistance, focused on high-value targets whose removal would directly disrupt Nazi operations. Gestapo informants, Dutch Nazi officials, and collaborator police who conducted raids and arrests. By early 1945, as Allied forces approached from the south and east, German control over the Netherlands began fragmenting under the pressure of military defeat and internal administrative collapse. Resistance activities intensified as fighters sensed liberation approaching, and German reprisals became more random and desperate. Hannie participated in weapon seizures, attacks on German supply convoys, and intelligence-gathering operations that helped Allied forces plan their advance. On March 21, 1945, 3 weeks before Canadian forces would liberate Haarlem, she was stopped at a checkpoint by members of the German security police who were conducting random searches for weapons and contraband. She was traveling with false papers under an assumed name, but the officers decided to conduct a thorough search of her belongings. They found nothing incriminating because she had left her weapon at a safe house, but one officer noticed the poor quality of her hair dye and became suspicious. They detained her for questioning, and during the interrogation her false identity began to unravel under detailed questioning about background details she couldn't adequately explain. The Gestapo realized they had captured someone significant, though they still didn't know specifically who. They transferred her to the prison at Haarlem for further interrogation, a process that quickly escalated into torture designed to force her to reveal her real identity and provide information about resistance networks. She revealed nothing despite weeks of brutal interrogation that left her severely injured. The Gestapo tried everything: physical torture, psychological manipulation, promises of lenient treatment in exchange for cooperation, and threats of execution. She maintained her false identity and claimed to be a minor participant in resistance activities with no knowledge of leadership or operations. Her interrogators didn't believe her but couldn't break her sufficiently to extract usable intelligence. By mid-April 1945, with Canadian forces advancing rapidly through the Netherlands and German forces in chaotic retreat, the Gestapo decided to execute high-value prisoners rather than allow them to be liberated. On April 17, 1945, just 3 weeks before the Netherlands was fully liberated, Hannie was taken to the dunes near Overveen, a desolate area used for executions throughout the occupation. She was 24 years old. According to witnesses who helped bury bodies after liberation, the German officer who shot her was inexperienced or deliberately careless, hitting her once, but not killing her instantly. She reportedly said, "I shoot better than you," before he fired again, killing her. Her body was buried in an unmarked grave with dozens of other executed prisoners in the dunes that would later become a national memorial site. Her death remained unknown to resistance networks for weeks because communication was fragmentary during the final chaotic period of occupation. When Canadian forces liberated Haarlem on May 5, 1945, resistance members immediately began searching for missing comrades, checking prisons, hospitals, and execution sites. Her body was identified through distinctive physical characteristics described by fellow resistance fighters, and her true identity was finally confirmed. The discovery that the girl with the red hair was Hannie Schaft, a law student from a respectable middle-class family, shocked the Netherlands and transformed her into an immediate national symbol. Newspapers published a story emphasizing the contrast between her ordinary background and her extraordinary courage, presenting her as representative of Dutch resistance writ large. Thousands attended her funeral when she was reburied with full honors at the Honorary Cemetery in Overveen in November 1945. Queen Wilhelmina personally laid flowers at her grave, and her story was taught in Dutch schools for generations as an example of resistance against tyranny. The post-war period brought complicated questions about collaboration, resistance, and moral responsibility that the Netherlands struggled to address adequately. Hannie's role as an armed operative who had killed collaborators at close range was celebrated as heroic resistance. But the same actions would have been considered murder under normal legal circumstances. This highlighted the fundamental ambiguity of resistance warfare. Actions that are terrorism or murder under occupation become heroism and patriotism after liberation, with the only difference being which side ultimately wins. The Dutch government struggled to prosecute collaborators effectively while simultaneously acknowledging that many ordinary citizens had made compromises necessary for survival under occupation. Hannie's unambiguous commitment to armed resistance made her easier to celebrate precisely because she never compromised or collaborated, dying rather than revealing information that would harm her comrades. Her youth and gender made her story particularly compelling for post-war narratives that emphasized resistance as a noble cause pursued by ordinary citizens rather than a complex moral landscape where most people made difficult compromises. Her legacy shaped Dutch national identity and collective memory in ways that persist into the present. She became the most famous Dutch resistance fighter, more celebrated than male operatives who had longer careers or more extensive operations. This reflected both genuine admiration for her courage and a tendency to romanticize female resistance fighters as particularly pure or innocent victims forced into violence by Nazi brutality. Her story was adapted into books, films, and television series that often emphasized her youth and beauty while downplaying the calculating pragmatism required for successful urban warfare. The 2019 Dutch film, The Resistance Banker, featured her prominently, though historians noted the portrayal sanitized the brutal reality of close-range assassinations. Streets, schools, and memorials throughout the Netherlands bear her name, and annual commemorations mark her execution date. She has become a symbol not just of resistance, but of moral clarity in the face of absolute evil, a figure who represents the possibility of individual action against systemic injustice. Modern historical analysis has complicated the straightforward heroic narrative without diminishing her courage. Scholars have examined the effectiveness of armed resistance operations, noting that assassinations of collaborators and German personnel did provoke savage reprisals that killed hundreds of innocent civilians. The strategic value of eliminating individual collaborators versus the cost in reprisal executions remains contested among historians. Some argue that armed resistance had primarily psychological rather than military value, demonstrating that occupation would be contested and making collaborators fear consequences for their participation. Others contend that the intelligence gathering and sabotage conducted by resistance networks had more concrete military value than targeted killings. These debates don't diminish Hannie's personal courage, but place her actions in a more complex, strategic context than immediate post-war narratives acknowledged. What remains indisputable is that she chose active resistance when most people chose accommodation or passive opposition, that she risked and ultimately lost her life fighting fascism, and that her example inspired thousands of others to resist rather than comply. In the final analysis, Hannie Schaft represents the transformation of ordinary citizens into fighters when confronted with moral absolutes. She wasn't a soldier, a revolutionary, or someone naturally inclined toward violence. She was a law student who believed in constitutional democracy and rational legal process, someone who should have spent the war years completing her degree and beginning a career as an attorney. Instead, she became an urban guerrilla who killed dozens of people at close range, who lived in constant danger of capture and execution, and who died 3 weeks before the liberation she had fought to achieve. Her story illustrates both the courage required for active resistance and the terrible costs that resistance exacts from those who pursue it. She paid for her convictions with her life, dying at 24 without seeing the country she helped liberate or knowing that her name would become synonymous with Dutch resistance for generations. The teenage girl who led a resistance army never saw herself as leading anything, never sought recognition or glory, and died anonymously in the dunes with dozens of other executed prisoners. It was only after liberation that her story emerged and she became the symbol she never tried to be, proving that sometimes the most powerful legacies are built by those who never intended to leave. One, who simply did what they believed was right regardless of the cost.